Hello and welcome to Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Thanks for joining me for another podcast conversation with changemakers accelerating the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society. Women are 49.7% of the world's population, and the percentage in some countries is north of 54%. Yet the World Economic Forum reported in 2021 that the Dominican Republic and the tiny African country of Eswatini are the only nations where male and female middle managers in companies have reached parity. And only 4 nations have reached parity in their national legislative bodies. My guests today, Patience Maureen Ball and Ruth Shaber, are the authors of The XX Edge, Unlocking Higher Returns and Lower Risk, which explains why the power and impact of women in business and leadership roles will be critical to turning this economy to a sustainable future. There's been progress in bringing women into leadership across society, but it is slow work. Just a few statistics make the problem plain. 42% of U.S. businesses are owned by women, and 19% of startups have at least one female founder. But according to the National Center for Educational Statistics, in 2018 and 19, women earned 57.9% of bachelor's degrees, 63.9% of master's degrees, and 56.4% of doctoral degrees. Yet only 1.9% of venture capital investments in 2022 were placed with women-led startups. You can see there's an immense amount of disparity. Soon, very soon, this must change, if only because of the retirement of the old boys networks that have dominated finance. In their book, Patience and Ruth share stories of corporate startups, nonprofits, and many other organizational innovations and improvements that are led by women. And they make a solid case that those of us with 2 X chromosomes bring essential skills that are in short supply in the face of climate change, social disruption, and the 20th century business strategies that are too exhausted to thrive in the 21st century. So let's talk about the XX age. You can find the book. It's available now. We'll include links to Amazon and Powell's books with the podcast, and you can learn more about Patience and Ruth at thexxedge.com. The XX Edge is all one word, no space, no dash, thexxedge.com. Welcome to the show, Patience and Ruth. How are both of you today?
We are as well as you are, Mitch.
Thank you for having us, Mitch.
Well, I just learned that Ruth may have been the doctor who delivered my son at the Kaiser Permanente Hospital in Redwood City, California. She was on call when you were there, but when we were there, it's a small and strange world. But you both have done some really interesting research on the role of women in business and society. And I wanted to ask a very high-level question first. What do you think the risks are to the economy and to society as a whole if women are not better represented in strategic and investment decisions in the future?
Well, we know that women actually have a really important voice and a really important perspective to add to the economy. And there's so much data and research that we uncovered in our book, The XX Edge, that demonstrates that when women are at the table, along with men, that we have more resilient outcomes, we have better solutions, and the economy grows. And so it's truly a missed opportunity when we don't use more diversity in our economic decision-making.
Well, it's interesting. We wouldn't recognize that we missed it because we haven't embraced it. And that's really the challenge that you write about in the book is moving from talking about it to doing it. Now, one of the things that I found particularly interesting is you emphasize the long view, which is a female perspective more than it is a male perspective. I tend to think I share that way of thinking. But how can we use the long view and the discussion around the long view to bring these values into a broader application? How can we build bridges in society using that idea?
Yeah. So in the book, thank you, Mitch, we talk about 3 characteristics or traits, or maybe tendencies, because nothing is absolute, right? That women tend to have compared to men, and one of them is the long view. But we also talk about risk awareness, and we talk about collaborative leadership. But the long view is particularly important because as we are seeing today, most of the challenges that the world faces today are challenges that have been brewing over a long period of time. And as long as we're making decisions, as decision-making rooms, prioritizing immediate gains, immediate profit, and seeing any of these things that are longer-term manifestation type dislocations and disruptions as externalities, then we end up in the kind of situation we are in today, where, things that were traditionally regarded as externalities are now coming in-house, whether that is, diversity, equity, and inclusion, excluding certain people from decision-making, from the benefits of society, whether it's climate change, thinking that, I can emit as much as I want, and, the impact is not going to come to my specific shore. Well, it turns out that climate impact is coming to every neighborhood. I was just reading this morning in my news feed. So Ruth was saying, she flew into California yesterday and just missed the beginning of the storm.
Right.
At the same time, I'm reading in the news, because I was born in Zimbabwe, that Cyclone Freddy is going to go down in history as one of the longest cyclones. And I don't even remember a cyclone hitting Zimbabwe in my lifetime, and I'm now in my 50s. And so these things are in every single neighborhood. And this idea that we only prioritize profits, we only prioritize what we see immediately, that is internal, is really not the right way to go. And that's why we believe that having women in the room really matters.
A great example of this was Dr. Jean Rogers, who founded the Sustainability Accounting Board about 15 years ago, well before we really started this conversation. But she managed to recognize and articulate the need for this broader sustainability assessment, which integrates both the long view and the risk management issues that you were talking about. How did she manage to take an industry, particularly an industry so nascent, and get them to embrace 77 standards quickly?
I think that's the part of, that's one of the, sorry, Ruth, I'm going to take this one. That's one of the beauties of collaborative leadership, right? First of all, that realization that what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. And then also recognizing that different industries would say, well, that issue is not my issue. So making the standards, they're quite industry specific. And yes, they're detailed, but there is value in those details so that different industries can see themselves in the frameworks, right? And then the other part is that the collaborative nature of her leadership, right? And the research that undergirded the approach that she brought to the table, right? So good research, industry-specific research, sort of data that made it real for different decision makers through that research was critical in ensuring the adoption of SASB, basically.
Yeah, it's funny. As you were speaking, I was thinking of what my grandmother, who was an early political activist in the Midwest, told me is, and it comes from her experience sewing: measure twice and cut once.
That's right. And as a data scientist myself, and really grounded in evidence, that's exactly right. You can't just take one piece of evidence and draw a conclusion from it. And that's one of the things that patients and I discovered in our research for the book, is that these are patterns and tendencies that women bring to the decision-making table that we see over and over and over again. It's not just a couple pieces of evidence. It's pervasive throughout, whether you're looking at small farmers in sub-Saharan Africa or CEOs of a Fortune 500 company. In every decision point in the supply chain of finance, when women are at the table, there's better outcomes, and not just for their enterprises, but better outcomes for the environment and their communities at large.
Well, and the idea of growth is the other key factor here. Is reducing risk in the future is another form of growth, but because we tend to emphasize, and particularly because of bro culture, emphasize immediate short-term growth. We don't really talk about where we could go. We talk about the latest piece of data and how we should react to it. How do you think our ideas about growth would change after a couple of decades of well-established female leadership?
Thanks for bringing up the bro culture, Mitch, because we wrote this book really hoping that men would appreciate it and read it. And that was our intention from the very start, that we're talking about things that are not just good for women, they're good for everybody. And that we recognize that the bros may be the last ones to appreciate what women can bring to the table in decision making. And one of the other things that we wanted to make clear, that when we talk about growth, economic growth with a diversity strategy, it's not a replacement strategy. It's about adding more people to the table. And that when that happens, also whether it's at the micro level in a small community or in a whole, multinational economies, that there's growth when there's diverse decision makers. And we know that when women entered the workforce in the 70s and 80s by 20%, that the decrease in men in the workforce was less than 2%. So I think there's many examples of how adding diverse teams does not cut off the people who've been at the table. It actually just makes more room for everybody.
And in addition to making more room, you're bringing different perspectives. And the IMF had a study, and I don't recall the year that they had this study, where they talked about the fact that productivity, the addition to productivity is actually different based on genders, because we don't bring the same sensibilities to the table. You actually have different forms of productivity emerging and actually adding to the pie, as Ruth just talked about. And the data, when folks have started actually the practice of measuring the impact on economies when you have diversity, the numbers are actually incredible. It begs the question, why don't we embrace this? McKinsey in 2015 released a study which covered a period. They were projecting it to a period between 2015 and 2025, where they indicated they looked at 95 countries and looked at gender diversity in those 95 countries and ranked these 95 countries and concluded that if these 95 countries got to gender parity in their economic activities, however you define that, they would actually be a bump of $28 trillion to the global economy. And even if you were conservative and only had the 95 countries not necessarily getting to parity, but each one of the countries getting as good as the country above it in the ranking, you would add $12 trillion to the global economy. That's a lot of money that can provide greater opportunity for more people and allow us to manage the next crisis better as well.
So another theme that just came into my mind is if we make a distinction between growth that you're talking about, which I think is also supportive of the notion of green growth, that we can still have an economic growth while being sustainable, is very different from, and so I'll coin a term here, growth.
Growth.
And the reason why, and as I was listening to you, is that the bros love to close the door and make the decisions and think they're in charge. And women consistently think about who's outside the door.
And I love that. I love that image. That's absolutely right. Women are so much more collaborative and welcoming to other opinions.
Yeah. Well, and so please go ahead, Patience.
I was going to say that I think that's informed by one of the other things we surfaced in this book, sort of the context. The context is that women are more proximate to the challenges that we're experiencing today, whether it's that proximity is in healthcare. So globally, more than 70% of healthcare staff that are frontline people are women. If it's in education, more than 66% of teaching staff globally are female. And the list just goes on, whether it's agribusiness production, the food security, more than 50% of farmers are women. And so that proximity to challenges makes them more sensible to the idea of the fact that as you're making decisions, you're not making decisions just for the unit and for the profitability of the company, but really stakeholders outside of the room as well.
Well, using an example that you talk about in the book, and you just mentioned it, 50% of smallholder farmers globally are women. And that's particularly an urgent issue in the global south where food supplies are very strained. If we took a bottom-up approach and focused on supporting them rather than supporting the agribusiness at the top of the pyramid, how would that change our food supply and food stress issues?
Well, I think there's lots of examples where when the folks who are at the front lines are involved in the decision making, that we have better solutions. And I can't give you any numbers. I haven't seen any study that actually extrapolates what we would see in the global economy, but we certainly have plenty of stories of how when women's leadership is recruited at the village level, at the farm level, and that we know that women tend to be more efficient with their resources. They tend to use whatever profits they do make in their own businesses and their own enterprises to feed their families and to make sure that their kids go to school, and that spills over into the communities they live in. And we certainly see this across the planet at whatever type of village or city, whether it's urban or rural, that when women have the say in how their communities are functioning, that we get much better efficiencies and benefits for everybody.
It's a more distributed prosperity is what
That's right. That's a great word for it.
I noticed in the book that you talk about the fact that female financial investors are about 42% more likely to recommend investments with social and environmental benefits. And you talk about 5 criteria for making an investment. Tell us about those, and how should we factor in the environment when we're thinking about our investment decisions?
Yeah, so there are many criteria out there for how people make investment decisions, but we think that with more women in the room, you will get more sensibilities. Looking around the corners, the ability to look around the corners at risks specifically, but also at opportunities. So if you are to, most people think that you do not have the opportunity for impact, positive impact, whether it's environmental, social, governance in public markets. We think you do. And more importantly, more people in the world believe that you actually do. And so there are all kinds of tools that are coming up. There are the negative screens. So yes, you can have, I don't want a portfolio that has any of these things, fossil fuels, civilian firearms, private prisons, or whatever it is. But there's also positive screens that you can employ. And the positive screens, the one that is our favorite, and for a reason, is the gender positive screen. How many women are in the C-suite positions? What roles do they actually have? How are they being rewarded? What benefits are accruing to not just the women, but also men in terms of family-related benefits, because we want both genders to be present for their families. So even in public markets where people believe that there isn't enough opportunity for impact, you can actually, you have tools out there that can allow you to do that. In private markets investing specifically, it's easier because, you can do rigorous due diligence that looks at the company's mission, its management, its services and products, its policies, the inclusion of people with lived experience in the company's infrastructure, whether it's the decision-making folks up at the top or the regular people doing the job on the front lines. You can look at geographic considerations, because the reality of it is that we have some parts of the world that are more forward in ESG. Europe comes to mind, and some parts of the world that are still lagging. But so geographic considerations allow you to also look at the regulatory frameworks in those regions, whether the regulators are providing tailwinds to the opportunity for companies to do better, or whether they're actually providing headwinds, as in some states in this country, sadly. And then you have the potential of engagement. What investor types are in especially on the private market side, are around you? Are these investors interested in engaging with management, for the management to do better? And then, Ruth and I, part of our favorite part of this book was really thinking about the everyday person. What can you do because every person is an investor, actually, making the decision to go to this store rather than that store, or, have your own garden, or, source your products from, a farmer who practices regenerative agriculture, whatever. That's an investment decision you're making, right?
And you're talking to an audience that is all about that. So what tools should they look for to find out, for instance, about female participation in management and just the composition of a company?
So you, Mitch, you may know some of these answers better than we do, but certainly there are fair trade labels. There are other types of multi-stakeholder initiatives around the planet. Some work better than others, of course, that help you do research on the products that you buy. And you can certainly, even though this is a very crude screen, you can just look for women-owned businesses in your own communities. And while there are plenty of terrific male-owned businesses as well, that when you're contributing to the success of female entrepreneurs and their businesses, you can be pretty comfortable thinking that they're going to do a better job of using their resources and considering the impact that they might have on their local and larger environments. Those are just, and when we promote women as entrepreneurs and business owners, their practices are going to diffuse and influence their communities of male-owned companies. So we're creating trends that everyone can't ignore.
Yeah, and if I could just add that there are tools, and we should mention some of the tools, because actually some of Ruth's philanthropic work has actually funded some of these tools. So there's an entity called Equileap, which is a 17 point scorecard that looks at how publicly traded companies are doing in terms of gender inclusion. But there are also tools like, as you saw, which has Invest Your Values tools, where you can go in and, if you have a mutual fund in your portfolio, type in the mutual fund, and it will tell you how well that mutual fund does across a number of sustainability themes, including the E, the S, and the G. And then for our part at Women of the World Endowment, we've invested in a tool called Ethos ESG, which actually does that at a single name security level. So you have the crude tools that Ruth talked about, just a Google search. You have, if you have mutual funds in your portfolio, a tool like, as you saw, and single name securities, a tool like Ethos ESG. But these are becoming more commonplace. And it's really for us as individuals to realize that for us to have a better world, what will it take? It takes we, the people, to make these decisions and use these tools.
And if we can live that ethos, I think we'll be better off. Let's take a quick commercial break before we continue this important conversation. And we are back to continue talking with Patience Maureen Ball and Ruth Shaber. They are the co-authors of The XX Edge, which is about unlocking higher returns and lower risk by involving women in more of our decisions across society. Climate change is what we talk about mostly here. Women are disproportionately impacted by climate change. And you write about the fact that these disruptions are a catalyst for feminist organizing and investing. How did feminist decisions change the outcome after Hurricane Andres? You talk about an organization called Women Will Rebuild. What did that do to the allocation of disaster funding?
Well, Mitch, I think that's a great example of women's collaborative leadership. I think first of all, we know that women are more impacted by these ongoing natural disasters. They tend to be the ones, for instance, in Hurricane Andres, they were the ones, women were more likely to end up on needing welfare or other types of public assistance if they were in these communities that were impacted by hurricanes. And we see that around the planet. I found the Women Will Rebuild example really interesting, because what happened were the women in these communities recognized that the existing municipal organizing did not have women representation, that folks were coming from the state level into their communities, had no knowledge of what was really going on and what needed to be fixed. And they were very frustrated by that lack of representation. And so they created their own grassroots organization called Women Will Rebuild, with the intention of petitioning for more resources and really assisting in the disaster recovery on a more organic level, using what they knew about what the actual needs were, because they were so much closer to the problems. I think there's other examples too of how women's grassroots organizing. The 1 Million Women's Initiative is another great example where women are being asked at their own level, in their households and the decisions they make every day, how can they bring a more environmentally focused perspective to their consumer decisions and to their voting decisions, and how they engage in their communities. So I think even just looking at Greta Thunberg and her popularity and how much she's inspired youth around the planet to pay attention to these things. So I think women are really instrumental in bringing their experience at a community level, sometimes because of disasters, sometimes because they're anticipating that things are going to only get worse, and how they organize and collectively bring many, many people to help solve these problems.
And maybe I could just add a little bit more to what you just said, Ruth, about it's not just in disaster settings, but it's also in the forward-looking. And this goes back to the question you asked right up front, Mitch, which was the long view. How do you build into the future? How do you build into a future of accelerating and more impact, negative impact type situations? You have, in the book, we talk about the example of the city of Medellin in Colombia, where, women recognized that their representation on the city council was important, but specifically their representation on the budget committee was important, because who makes, asset allocation decisions determines its purpose. And they wanted for the purpose to be the building of a city that would be a smart city, that would be resilient, that would enable greater prosperity for more people, more inclusive prosperity. So that's just one example. And then in 2022, you have the big flooding that happened in Pakistan that covered a third of the country. And the forward-looking nature of women's thinking came to the fore quite a bit. I excuse me, I've enjoyed reading about Yasmin Lari, Pakistan's first female architect, who's now 81 years old. And she recognized in that moment that disaster relief housing that was being put in place needed to actually be housing that would be sustainable. Because if it wasn't sustainable, they were just adding to the problem that had resulted in the disaster they were facing at that point. And she championed sustainable disaster relief housing. And, these are the ways that women come to the table, even at 81, with forward-looking, prospects for economies and stakeholders.
And you're describing one of the problems we have when we talk about the future of the economy is that there's this we have to make an exception because everything's so urgent. We don't need to be sustainable. We just need to solve the problem, but you need to think more long-term. And this is where I think the transformative role of women, both as employees and consumers, is going to be so important to the next 50 years. 65% of women care that the company they work for makes genuine sustainability efforts compared to 39% of men. How do you see women's economic influence changing as millennials, Gen Z, and now Gen Alpha, who are 11 years old now, come to be the majority in society over the next couple of decades?
Well, we've seen that in the whole creation of an ESG movement, that women were the ones at the table. Women were the ones who were driving this, and often as a relatively narrow, whether they were in a financial house of some kind and they were carving out some sort of ESG strategy. And as women were driving this over decades, now we see it's becoming mainstream. And despite the recent political backlash, we know that integrating what we've been calling an ESG, but let's just call it a sustainable perspective, is going to be essential for any kind of business. And women have been the leaders of that. We also know that women tend to have an environmental or climate perspective, no matter what business they're in. So no matter what kind of company they're running or involved in the senior leadership for, that they are more likely to integrate in sustainable practices, in whether it's their energy consumption or their practices regarding recycling or how they think about supporting their workforce, travel policies, all kinds of things that add up to tremendously important for the environment are the kinds of decisions that women tend to make every day when they are in a role of leadership.
Well, it strikes me that the anti-ESG movement is in a lot of ways the bro culture is simply saying we can't count these things because if we count them, we have to change them.
That's right.
And you write that sustainability and equity are the levers that women can use to raise their influence in society. Tell me about how we should be thinking about the relationship between gender and racial equity as we continue to evolve as a group of humans trying to get along.
Well, I'm going to start that answer and then I'm going to hand it off to Patience. And I think what's one thing that we found in our research is that most of the studies that have been done that are so clear about the power of diversity were done using a gender focus. And that was our choice in writing the book, that we really did lean into the research around gender. But the rationale for why diversity increases and improves outcomes, both in the types of solutions that are generated and the risk mitigation, all the things that are so important to our economy, we believe quite strongly are true for any type of diversity. That when you have a room full of people making a decision that all look exactly the same, that you're going to miss things, that you're not going to see around the corners, that you're going to generate the same kinds of solutions that you've always had. And that's not what our current situation requires.
Yeah, and I'll just add that the connection is actually in the most basic of ways, that it's the lived experience, right? The lived experience of being excluded of solutions, viewing women and people of color as victims or beneficiaries. And capital markets has been really good at that. Traditional capital markets has viewed women and people of diverse origins as beneficiaries. We're going to do this stuff, we're going to make these decisions and they will benefit. And so it's okay that the rooms of decision making are not diverse. And so it's as basic as that. The work that has to be done in recognizing the opportunity that the world has is to really think about diversity as a lever, and that people who come from diverse lived experiences are actually incredible solution drivers, because those solutions, the solutions that are innovated when more lived experiences are in the room, tend to be more resilient. And even if we were to just make it about profitability, they tend to actually be more profitable because you're addressing the needs of a greater part of the world, of the customer base. And so even if your only lens is how much money am I going to make, having diversity in the room and thinking of inclusion instead of exclusion, and folks as actors instead of beneficiaries and victims, it's still going to make you money, and it's going to grow the pie for everybody.
And so I want to ask you about a couple of industries where we have very significant challenges. How do you imagine these could change if we brought women into leadership? And we'll start with healthcare. Could we reduce our overall costs in the United States, which are absurdly high compared to the rest of the world, and we underperform most of the world in terms of our health? How would we change? Could we change it? And Ruth, I'll ask you because you're the doctor.
Right. And there is no question that the U.S. healthcare system is profoundly broken, and for many reasons, and especially if we compare to other industrialized countries that have much better outcomes for much less cost. And we think about there's this pervasive myth that the United States has the best healthcare system in the world, and that is so wrong. Not only because it costs so much, but because our outcomes are poor. I mean, if you just look at the maternal health death rate, particularly for Black women in the United States, it's just horrible embarrassment that we can't do better with all the resources that we pour into our system. I think there's many reasons why the healthcare system is broken. And your specific question, though, about how could having more women in leadership fix it? I think, I had my experience in healthcare at an integrated healthcare system called Kaiser Permanente. And most of the United States healthcare system is very disintegrated, where we have silos and incentives are not coordinated at all. And the nature of women's leadership is to be more collaborative, to be more inclusive in how we think about, is everyone going to benefit from this decision we're making? Not just my people, not just the hospitals, or not just the insurance companies, or not just the providers. We know that the workforce in healthcare is predominantly female. We saw it over and over again with the pandemic. We saw the women doctors, the women nurses, the women respiratory therapists, the technicians, the people driving the ambulances. And yet at the senior most levels in the healthcare system, it's all men still. Women represent less than 25% of the senior most healthcare decision makers. And that's not just at the hospitals, but it's the insurance companies, it's the doctors groups, it's the pharmaceutical companies that are driving the innovation and what kinds of treatments are being brought to market.
Well, do you think in particular that if we were to reorient around preventative care, we would radically change our outcomes?
Absolutely. And if you look at societies that have, a 100th of the resources, Cuba is a great example where they are purely focused on prevention, and their workforce and their leadership is largely female. That they do prioritize what is going to prevent the costly illnesses and the drain on resources, as opposed to the United States model, where we really are primarily providing incentives for illness. And people make money in the healthcare industry when there's more people in the hospital and when there's more people who are sick, which is just crazy. And so I have great conviction that if we could turn our healthcare system upside down and put the folks who have been at the front lines actually at the top making the decisions, that we would have a much better system, not just for the quality outcomes, but for the cost as well.
Now, another area is food and food production, our supply chains. We need to move to more regional circular economies. What would women's leadership look like in building that new nested global economy of various regional economies?
Yeah. So we discussed earlier on the fact that more than 50% of smallholder farmers around the world are female, but in places like Africa, that number actually goes up to 70%. And this is an opportunity for all kinds of disruptions, including as we centralize climate and its impact on food security, on value chains. We can really take into account the experiences of those that are closest to the farm. And in Africa, as I said, it's 70%. Globally, it's more than 50%. But it's an opportunity to bring back regenerative agricultural practices. Seven Sisters. It's even called Seven Sisters because I'm sure it's an age-old farming practice that's Native American, etc. But I'm sure it was called Seven Sisters because it's women who thought about these things, that you can build production structures that are regenerative while also providing food for people. But there's also the opportunity to actually take care of the world's natural assets, right? So, not just extractive, not just looking at our natural assets as extractive opportunities, but also how do we conserve them? So in the book, we have an interview that Women of the World Endowment did with a gentleman named Douglas Eager, who's launched a platform on the New York Stock Exchange called the Intrinsic Exchange Platform, and his company is Intrinsic Exchange Group. And they're really looking at how do we monetize, or how do we create value for conservation of natural assets, and actually create natural asset companies that can be publicly traded, and the value, the money that comes from that can be used to provide better support for our natural resources. And to Ruth's point, the fact that women are comfortable with collaborative leadership, even at the farm level, that would also come into play as we create potential for cooperatives at the local level, these cooperatives would then be able to access capital, because these are some of the issues that are the friction points in the system. Why women farming is not as productive or even as resilient as it should be, because access to capital, once again, they're beneficiaries and victims, so they don't have good access to capital. We could create more cooperatives that would allow for greater access to inputs, to capital, to education, to all kinds of ways that farming can be both resilient, regenerative, and provide our food security.
Well, and so the last industry I want to talk about is technology, which of course modulates the stories we tell one another and access to systems like the platforms that could redistribute capital more efficiently. And we've already talked about the bros and the brocoder, but the brocoder culture is toxic. How would more women leaders change the way we use technology? And I ask that as somebody who's been involved in that industry for 35, 40 years now. I haven't seen I've seen some great women leaders, but I've never seen them get to actually change their companies deeply.
So there's examples of this both at, a really local, innovative level, and certainly at a broader technology level. One example that I love came out of India, where women were really appalled by the violence in their communities. And after some young women had been raped on a bus, they recognized that they could adapt technology that is so available throughout the world, which is our GPS and ability to, Waze and Google Maps, which tell us when there's an incident, when there's an accident, because it's crowdsourced, because people put in the information in real time. And how can you adapt a technology like that to solve the really horrible and pervasive problem of violence in a community? And what they did was able to adapt this application so that people could input where violence was happening. You could find out where there was a street lamp that was burnt out so that you knew what corner to avoid on your walk home from work, or an abandoned building that was a source of violence. And it ended up being a resource for the local people, and particularly women, to keep themselves and their families safe. But also communities and governments picked up on it and were able to replace that light bulb or tear down the building that was a threat. And I think there's lots of examples more broadly where we talk in the book quite a bit about the use of AI and how when artificial intelligence doesn't take into account, for instance, facial recognition software, and how poorly it takes into account non-white features. And there's been some tremendous grassroots activism around how AI is being used for whether it's for policing or other ways that are really going to be have quite a bit of collateral damage to our communities if we don't recognize the need for diverse considerations.
Yeah,
Cooperative approaches.
And absolutely. Sorry, Mitch, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Please go ahead.
It's cooperative approaches. Please, patience. Go ahead.
100%. And one of the other examples that we have, so Ruth is as just discussed at the micro level, and the innovation level, but also even at the macro level, you have an opportunity. And we have the story of Portugal that we cite in the book. And one of the reasons why Portugal has become is a highly connected country. And you have a lot of technology companies putting their second headquarters in Portugal, and a lot of digital citizens are moving to work from Portugal. Work becomes more remote, which is actually really good for women as well. Is the fact that the ministry that was responsible for technology in Portugal has traditionally had women in leadership roles. And these women from the beginning recognized that decentralized systems were really critical. So they had citizen-led task forces where they got feedback from the citizens, and then they built the infrastructure on the back of this sort of decentralized way of bringing in information. and then providing decentralized opportunities for digital growth and connectivity in the country. It seems simple, but it's when you have people at the table who have traditionally been left out of opportunities that you have this different way of viewing how opportunity can be more inclusive.
What I hear you saying is that if we can seed society with the appropriate participation of women in leadership, that it will self-organize based on a longer view, a risk-aware but generous approach to sharing resources into something much more sustainable and much more equitable. Both of you are working on other projects in addition to the book. Can you tell us about what you're doing, Patience, at the Women of the World Endowment? And Ruth, talk about your philanthropic work. How can folks follow along with both of you?
Yeah. So thank you very much for this question, Mitch, and for allowing us to tell you a little bit more about the work that we're doing. So I lead an organization called Women of the World Endowment, which we founded in 2018. And this comes out of my extensive experience in the investment world. And I realized that the issue with capital markets specifically is that it has traditionally viewed women as victims and beneficiaries and not really solution drivers and actors. And Women of the World Endowment, essentially, our North Star, our theory of change is that by centralizing women as change makers, as solution drivers, as key asset allocators, we will have differentiated portfolios, but we're going to have differentiated solutions to the world's most pressing problems. And so the work we do is we are C3, so we're a nonprofit, but we are C3 that also does investing. And our investment thesis is really about how do we build and augment the data that's out there. There's incredible data that says when women are centralized, good things happen for profits and people and planet. But how do we continue to augment that? And so we have an investment strategy that does that. We have also an advisory services practice that's really looking at how do we create leverage and influence and take this strategic capital that we know and take it to more entities so that we're removing the friction out of the plumbing system of capital markets so that more people are investing with this thesis and this sensibility. And finally, we do some grant investing as well, but mostly not at the last mile, but mostly at the first mile of grant investing, which is mostly catalytic investing. And there we're looking at data sets around the world and looking at how these data sets can be translated to investable strategies. So right now, we are partnering with an entity out of Europe, an academic entity that's been collecting data for 10 years on women and women's leadership, but also women's power when they're in those leadership seats. And we will hopefully be coming out with either an SMA, a separately managed account strategy, or an ETF kind of strategy. In other words, we build the data, we advise people on how to see the world the way we see it. And then finally, we are doing this work of creating investable strategies so we can say, here are the opportunities that you can actually invest into for a different world and different outcomes.
Ruth, how about you?
So I'm running the Tara Health Foundation, which is looking at an integrated capital strategy across all asset classes, but we do quite a bit of grant making in the fields of reproductive health, women in the workplace, and we engage corporates in their policies around reproductive health and maternal health. And our most recent initiative, which I'm so happy to be partnering with Patience on, is we've launched a gender diverse investment collective. And what we found in the book is that while women are entering the fields of finance through business school and even at the level of investing knowledge and literacy for girls, that they're still managing a very small amount of the world's capital. Yeah. That one statistic that we didn't really touch on is that 98% of the capital decision-making in the world, and the amount of money that's managed, 98% of it is still made by white men. Mm-hmm. And we know that if we can change those numbers, that we can bring more women into managing more dollars, that we're going to have better outcomes for everybody. And so we are launching the 33 by 33 campaign, which is looking to increase the amount of assets under management by gender diverse teams to 33% by 2033.
That would make a huge difference. Patience and Ruth, thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Our
Thank
pleasure.
you,
Thanks for having
it's
us.
been
Mitch.
fun.
We've been speaking with Patience Maureen Ball and Ruth Shaber, co-authors of The XX Edge, Unlocking Higher Returns and Lower Risk. We'll include links to buy the book in the article that introduces this podcast, and you can find out more about the XX Edge, Patience and Ruth at The XX Edge. That's all one word, no space, no dash, thexxedge.com. Folks, it's time we open the doors to the back rooms of power and end the dominance of growth, that male-dominated decision-making that has led us to the place we are today. And time to embrace the true growth that includes the priorities and ideas of women and diverse communities. Like biodiversity in the natural world, which has evolved by trying everything to process the stuff of life into new, improved generations, business and government will benefit and produce equitable outcomes when they welcome diverse perspectives. That distributed prosperity is the key to introducing green growth, the benefit of sustainable thinking that creates new wealth at the grassroots in regional economies that grow and keep more cash within their communities instead of just exporting wealth to multinational entities. Patience and Ruth mentioned many resources to keep in mind as you shop, invest, and vote to create the world you want. Take some time today to learn about As You Sow. It's a nonprofit shareholder activist organization. Ethos ESG, a values-based tool for filtering investment options, as well as about Patience's work at the Women of the World Endowment and Ruth's at the Terra Health Foundation. And you folks can help by sharing this podcast and the more than 380 other interviews we've done on sustainability in your ear. I hope you'll take a moment to share this podcast by writing a review on your favorite site. You folks are the amplifiers that spread more ideas to create less waste. So please tell your friends, family, and coworkers they can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, and all the other fine purveyors of podcast goodness. Thank you very much for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Earth 911, and we'll be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.